time. Baruch Hashem, the technical stuff is working out. So, welcome to the fourth out of five talks on this series called Balfour Declaration, 100 years later. Tonight is the fourth lecture entitled Why Were Anti-Semites Created? The Issuing of the Balfour Declaration. Tonight's lecture, as you can see, is a historic because the original nusach was a couple weeks ago before the wedding, and so it was sponsored in honor of the forthcoming marriage of Ari and Heather, which is the children of the Elbaums. And now I'm happy to say that as soon as the wedding took place, I had to call Susan and say, you have to adjust the title to meet the recent marriage. So you've just seen history in the making. Now, so mazel tov once again to the Elbaums, and thanks to all the sponsors over there, to Avron, to the cousin, and Brad Kaufman, is a very good friend, and to the Chernoffs, who are all part of a do-gooder outfit. Let me say that we're now on, as I said before, the fourth of these lectures, so I see a room full of gluttons for punishment. I'm going to have to get you all a T-shirt, glutton for punishment, glutton for history, right? To go through that. What's that? Not with my picture on it, but we will we'll cast a lot for whose picture should go in it. Maybe Balfour. And without any further ado or further witticism, we'll get down to work, because as always we have a lot to do. Tonight we look at the Jewish side of things in the fateful years of 1914, 1915, 1916, and 1917. That's 3.5 fateful years. And I spent a lot of time, as necessary, talking about the non-Jewish stuff, because the Balfour Declaration, you'll be shocked to hear, was not issued by Jews. Okay? Now, the question then becomes like this. So now that we set up the cast of characters, or I've tried to, how did the Zionists interact with the international players? And I emphasize the word players because they're the ones that count, not the public figures necessarily, but the ones that actually make decisions and get things done. First of all, the Zionists did not know exactly who are the players, because as I said before, you don't necessarily go to the candidate or the representative or the public figure. It may be the wife, the secretary, to this, to that. Could be the third clerk who does the real stuff. The Zionists knew who the leaders of Britain are. They knew who the leaders of the other governments were, the public figures, but who the players, you know what I mean? So here you have a picture of prominent public figures. But the guy on the left is the foreign minister. The guy on the right is the real player, Arthur Nicholson, because he's what they call the permanent undersecretary. In other words, the civil servant. In Britain and in many, if not most, parliamentary democracies, and it's not exactly true in this country, it's true to a limited degree, but in most countries, there is a permanent civil service which does not change with the elections. As I said before, in America, we don't exactly have that tradition. We have it to some degree. So everybody knows when Trump came in, he kept some, he didn't keep some stabbed in the back, some he stabbed them in the back. That's kind of like the American tradition. Used to be long ago, before 120 years ago, in the good old days of what they call Jacksonian democracy, you got elected, you fired the entire federal government from top to bottom, if anybody knows their American history. And that is why you had such enthusiastic campaign workers back in the 1800s, the elections, because you get a job. I'm talking about, as the classic saying goes, I want to be the postmaster in Paducah. You understand? The collector of customs in New Orleans or wherever else. And president, the spoil system, we called it. And Abraham Lincoln, to give you an example, spent a lot of his time just signing papers all through his 4 years in the White House, pointing this guy to this post and that one to that post and so forth. And then they had in this country called civil service reform. So 10% or 20% of the civil service became immune from being fired. But we've had a different system. In England, which is what we're looking at over here, the tradition has always been that they're the permanent people, and then they're the ministers that come and go from the parties. And, like you just had an election last week in Britain, which was a flop, and heads will roll, and other people take the position, but the civil servants who run the operation always stay. So if you're a Chaim Weizmann or one of these people, the guy on the right is just as important, and sometimes more important than the guy on the left. That's my point. So they know that, but discovering who the players were and getting to them was the official responsibility of one man and the passionate avocation of another, of Nachum Sokolow and Chaim Weizmann. Nachum Sokolow is not very well known, and then I saw on the internet the other day that somebody put an article about him trying to make Tchias HaMesim, which was, somewhat, it wasn't exactly correct, but it was somewhat correct. Nachum Sokolow was unusual. I mean, all these guys are unusual people. Nachum Sokolow was a Polish from a Hasidic family who grew up and became a Moscow, and he pretty much invented modern Hebrew journalism, which is why in Israel, Ari knows what I'm talking about, in Tel Aviv, the house of the Itonaim is called Beit Sokolow, because he's the one who made Hatzfirah, the famous magazine. This used to be considered the number one Hebrew newspaper. Back in the day when in Eastern Europe you had a large Eastern European Jewish population, and some of them could read Hebrew. To be perfectly honest, most people in Eastern Europe couldn't read Hebrew any more than most of you can unless you lived in Israel. I'm not talking about reading a siddur and saying a bracha, but I mean read a Hebrew newspaper. And I don't want to get too far into this. Let's just say Nachum Sokolow emerged as a very famous person in Hebrew journalism, and then and he was very anti-Hasidic, and then he became pro-Hasidic. It's a long story, but he emerged as a friend of Theodor Herzl, and he became a big macher in the Zionist movement. And eventually, he moved to the West, to Germany, and then to England. And he's an interesting guy from the shtetl who reinvented himself as a European gentleman and a diplomat. Jews are good at this sometimes when they really make an effort. He really learned Hilchos Europe, to stand up when a lady walks in, to open a door, to speak in French and 12 or 13 other languages, I mean it. And to learn the language of diplomacy, which is you say something, you don't mean it, but the other guy knows you don't mean it, but you know that the other guy knows you don't mean it, and all the rest of it. And as I say before, he became, in the decade before the First World War, the foreign minister of Zionism, so to speak. He had a million meetings all the time with the German diplomats and the British and the French, and he knew what the foreign ministries looked like. Now, they didn't pay any attention to him, because before the First World War, Zionism didn't exist, as I told you before. Theodor Herzl had 5 minutes of fame because he was a PR genius. And after he died, it was garnished. But he would come and give him a memorandum and tell him what's going on in Palestine, and they would file it away and so forth. But at least, let's put it this way, it's not dead. There's some of us that are, that are still alive. But as I said, his meetings constantly with journalists, and he was a journalist himself, with diplomats, with politicians, other public figures, made him cosmopolitan and multilingual, familiar with all the arguments for and against Zionism, because he's heard them all, right? You go to the Germans, they say, what about this? You go to the Austrians, they say, what about that? He knows all the arguments in favor and against. And it turned him, as I say, into charming and well-mannered, which wasn't so common for Jews then or now. Now, present company excluded. Now, these, as I say before, these were the lean years when Zionism was not taken seriously. But by the time the First World came around, he was somebody with a reputation. Chaim Weizmann was somewhat different. He wasn't a Polish, he was a Russische. And he came from a little shtetl, I think near Pinsk. Not from a poor family, by the way. And just for public information, that's the cousin of Howard Elbaum. Now, the Chaim Weizmann did not want to be a shtetl Jew, as many didn't. And so he reinvented himself, but in a different way. He didn't want to be like a Nachum Sokolow either, which is just to recreate yourself, but still be a person without any credentials. He actually made it his business to go to school, get a PhD in chemistry. Couldn't get in Russia, so he went to Switzerland. That's what they did, as did many. And he was a real chemist. I think we saw yesterday in that Lloyd George business that he was a serious person. They say, I'm not qualified to speak on this, but I've heard that if he would have thrown himself totally into chemistry, he would have got a Nobel Prize in the end, meaning he was that level, okay? It's just that he spent a lot of time doing design in some business. So he was a worshiper of Echad Ha'am, which means that, believe it or not, when Herzl was alive, Chaim Weizmann was always giving Herzl a headache. And the reason is, you're too good to the frum. Theodor Herzl did not want civil wars among the Jews. Neither did Nachum Sokolow, by the way. We have enough trouble with the anti-Semites, and she's a little bit in the role like Bibi is today, which is, can't we just make all this stuff go away? We got a lot of problems out there. Why do we have to fight among ourselves? And Chaim Weizmann and Chad Am said, this is treason. If you're too giving and too, what's the right word, making concessions to the Orthodox, they'll take over the Zionist movement, they'll turn Israel into a shtetl, it'll be just horrible, it'll be this, that, and the other. And so he was a foremost opponent of Orthodox Judaism throughout his life. I just want you to know that's who Chaim Weizmann was. But he got a professor position, assistant professor in Manchester University. That's a real place. So as I say before, he moved from being in the shtetl to having a job, and he did a lot of research, and he also got contracts with private industry. So, I mean, as I say before, the guy had a day job. And in his spare time, he was a Zionist activist. It's hard to describe these people because we're doing in Baltimore, which is a provincial kind of place. These people couldn't stand provincial places. He couldn't stand in Manchester. I'm told, I've never been in England, but I'm told Manchester is something like Baltimore. These people lived in Berlin, in Paris, in Vienna, au courant with the latest trends in thought, with the newest books. You sit around in the cafe places and you talk about all the culture things in 12 languages. You don't talk about the Baltimore Orioles, You get it, come on. And Weizmann writes when he's in Manchester, he says, listen, it's a living, but this is a terrible place to live, there's no culture here, and so on and so forth. But he said, I'll make the best of what it is, because I'd rather have a real job than live in a brilliant fashion as a Luftmensch, in Berlin or Vienna, you understand? And so it's just interesting in that regard. And his spare time was devoted to Zionist activity, to Zionism. Now, along the way, in order to achieve these positions, he also had to learn Hilchos Goyim the way that Sokolow did. How to turn yourself into something of a gentleman, like I say before, provide a seat for a lady, speak in French, show that you know what's going on in books and plays, music, art, literature, and so forth. Make the right kind of, listen to this, make the right kind of joke at a party and not make the wrong kind of joke at a party. Jews are not too good at that, right? Say the right thing and don't say the wrong thing. Knowing to keep your mouth shut. These are all things he had to learn along the way. And he developed his own particular unique brand of cosmopolitanism with nationalism. His shtick was always to be very charming and very European and say, but I'm not a European, I'm a Jew. That contrast always kind of worked well with Gentile interlocutors, which he tailored for the English in a certain way. And as a result, he met a lot of important people along the way with whom he was able to establish a rapport, a charm. He knew Lloyd George from way before the war. He knew Balfour. Balfour was was prime minister. He was a member of parliament from North Manchester. That's where Weizmann lived. Okay, so during the election campaigns, you know who else was a member of parliament from Manchester? Winston Churchill. You see, Manchester was a bastion of the Liberal Party. I'm talking about 100 years ago. Not today, of course. I'm talking about 100 years ago in the time of Asquith and Lloyd George. And the Manchester Guardian was the paper of the Liberal Party, long ago. And Weizmann made his business to get in with all these type of guys. And he was just very good at what they did. Now, these were all important meetings in 1906, 1907, 1908, but politically insignificant because of the pre-war realities. So it was a famous meeting he had with Balfour, where Balfour says, I never meet Jews like you, And Weizmann said, well, you never meet the right kind of Jews, and things like that. Which means the English Jews are not representative. They're fake Jews. They're trying to pretend they're English, and so on and so forth. They don't really have it. We Jews from the shtetl, I represent the folk genius of 6 million Jews back in Russia. And for a guy like Balfour, he said, that makes sense. You understand? So this is what you call planting a seed. Because in 1906 or 1907, as I said before, the First World War was beyond anybody's dream. But as a wise politician, that's not the right word, as a wise negotiator, it's good to put whatever you can out there, because you never know when it'll come in handy. The smart people in life are those who are nice to everybody. Why? Because tomorrow, the little person might be a big person. Okay? So that's exactly what he did. Now, of course, in 1914, with the outbreak of war, this changed things. And now, as I said yesterday, Turkey is going to lose the war, perhaps, and something might happen to Israel. How do we get to the British government? How does that work? And more importantly, Weizmann was wise enough to realize, how do you get to the players, the ones that really count? Now, he was a lone wolf. Believe it or not, he was not really a member of the Zionist movement in a big position, because he was out in Manchester in a nowhere place. He had a day job with the Navy, the Admiralty, as they call it, as a chemist. He was fully employed all through the war, 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, in that Lloyd George stuff that we saw yesterday, doing genuine scientific work for the Admiralty. You know, war is great for the scientists, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's I'm talking for Defense Department, all the rest of it. And so he was smack in the middle of all that. So whatever he did in World War I, which is about 2,000 interviews with British people from top to bottom, he did along with the day job, which is really kind of interesting. But he tries to network as much as possible. And, you know, the old line, the Lubavitch notice, you see, talk to 10 people, maybe get one. Talk to 100 people, you'll definitely get one. Talk to 1,000 people, you definitely get 10 or 20. Talk to 10,000 people, you get 1,000, you know? So it's just you have to have the Sitzfleisch to talk and meet. And you'll get, you know, from all the people saying no, sooner or later somebody will say yes. And that's exactly what he did. So he went to every party he could go to, and he went to every interview he could get. And sooner or later he got lucky when he met this young girl over here who was 18 years old, and she just got married to Rothschild, right? Dorothy Rothschild, Devora. Dorothy Rothschild, who was married a man 20 years older than her. She was 17, he was 37, 38. James de Rothschild, the son of the famous Rothschild from Israel. So I told you can make a mini-series just on this. Sooner or later they will. And she was a Pinto, Sephardic, right? They're all related. Her father from Egypt, made a fortune over there, moved to London. She grew up in London, probably went to some finishing business. And as I said before, as soon as she went out of high school, well, 17 anyway, as soon as she went out of high school, she got engaged and married the son of Edmund Rothschild, James Armand Rothschild. So right off the bat, she's in the party scene, correct? I mean, you know, balls and all this kind of stuff. Listen, Rothschild, billionaires. That's not even the right word. But I mean, you're talking about 100 years ago when money was money. So, you know, these people are at the peak of European finance. You don't need me to tell you that. And so she knows everybody. And since she was so young when she got married, she wasn't spoiled. She was still a good Jewish girl. You get it? So she cares about Eretz Yisrael. She, you know, I won't say she's a Beis Yaakov girl, but she, you know, she cares about Jewish causes more than her husband. To be perfectly honest, she slept in it the way Herbert Samuel's wife did that to him. It's one could give. I'm not doing that. One could give the story of the women in the Balfour Declaration, and I don't mean that to be funny at all. And so she meets Weizmann, and she's like this. He says, "I'm gonna back you." As I say, she married her husband for love, among other reasons. And look, the guy married a Jewish girl. Many Rothschilds didn't. I'll tell you the reason he did, even though he was in his late 30s. He's the son of the famous Rothschild from Israel, Paris, Baron Edmund de Rothschild, the famous Hanadiva Yadu, as they call him in Israel. Well, Edmund de Rothschild wasn't so frum, but he married his cousin. He married the daughter of Rothschild of Frankfurt. Her parents were from. They were the one exception. Carl Wilhelm on the left side, you know, on the left up there, that's Baron Carl Wilhelm von Rothschild, who lived in a palace in Frankfurt. And he was the president of the synagogue of St. Raphael Hirsch. That is one of the reasons they never suffered a deficit. But I'm serious. And that's one of the reasons Hirsch could do whatever he wanted. And they're ultra-Orthodox within a German milieu. And there are many, many stories about that. So when he permitted his daughter to marry Edmund Rothschild in Paris, first of all, it's a cousin. But second of all, it was all with the idea like this. She will keep kosher. You don't have to, but she will keep kosher. If you're Rothschild, it's not a problem. It's a treif kitchen. It's a kosher kitchen. You see? So, you know, when for Shabbos meals, it's over here. For week deals, he you know, they have a long table. He eats the treif, she eats the kosher. That's where we went. And if you're really Rothschild, which they were, they even had a yacht with 2 sets of kitchens on the yacht. So when he comes to visit Palestine in 1914, just for the First World War. A Jewish delegation comes on board, and basically the waiters are like this: do you want this kitchen or do you want this kitchen over here? So when you're rich, they think you really know. Anyhow, so she's a Jewish girl with a Jewish heart. And she says, I'm going to try to help you. And that means I'm going to invite you to all the right parties, and I'm going to introduce you to all the right people. I'll do the best I can. But this is the society dame of the highest level. And she goes, first of all, to try to win her cousins over because they were very powerful figures. And they were weirdos. Look at this guy, Walter Rothschild, driving a zebra. Okay? You know, and you know the reason why is he driving a zebra? Because he can, you know? Here's the other guy with a butterfly net, you know? Now, the truth of the matter is the Rothschild family is loaded. They did very little for the Jewish people. But they did a little bit. What I'm describing to you is among the most important things that they did. Because for people with their kind of money, they spend all their time, and still do, saving the whales, going for the butterflies, did zoology, Egyptology, and 100 other ologies over there, and it is what it is. But and she wasn't even really a Rothschild. That's the point. You understand? So she slept it in, and he was sufficiently Jewish because of his mother, you know, to go along. And she says like this: I'm going to talk to Walter. I'm going to talk to the other guys. Listen, if you lived in a palace like that, you can drive a zebra too. Now, let me tell you something. When the Balfour Declaration will be issued, it'll be a letter not to the Jewish people because the Jewish people don't exist. It'll be to Walter Rothschild, dear Lord Rothschild. Number one, Howard the Zebras. Number two, His Majesty's government wishes to inform you that his views will favor the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, so Weizmann really was helped by this, shall I say, feminine mafia. And he developed, he had cultivated his own Manchester mafia, or Chevra, who operated on their own like an independent Zionist franchise. Because remember, he's not in London, he's in Manchester. And what he did, being bored out of his mind, was to meet other young Jews. Now, these are English boys who went on to big careers. And they're all born around 1880 or so in Manchester. So it's in the first wave of the Russian Jews coming over, and they're born in England, coming from Yiddish-speaking families. They go to they go to Manchester Grammar School. That's a real school. And some go to Oxford and places like that, University of London. So they anglicized, but they're still the first generation, so they got a lot of Judaism in them. They don't want to be frum, most of them. But in those days, if you want to be Jewish and not be frum, Zionism is the answer. You throw yourself into work on behalf of Israel. So Harry Sacker, for example, on the left, Gon Sacker, says Harry Sacker became a leading columnist in Manchester Guardian. And he was an important attorney. Later he moved to Palestine. He had the #1 law firm. People in England will know on the right-hand side, Marks and Spencer, the famous department store guys. They're two young guys that worked with Chaim Weizmann. Leon Simon in the middle is also a Manchester boy who became the top civil servant in the post office, the permanent undersecretary in the post department. In other words, for a Jew, and not a not a self-hiding Jew, to rise in the English civil service. By the way, he became a permanent undersecretary of the post office in World War II, time of a lot of anti-Semitism, is kind of impressive. So these are people who are, as I say before, not necessarily observant, a little bit here, a little bit there, but they're passionately Jewish. And they really care about seeing if they can get the fulfillment of Zionist dream, which is to get some kind of a Jewish state, if possible, or something along those lines in Palestine and Israel. And that is Weizmann's little chevra. He doesn't have time to talk to the Jews around the world. He's not in official position, believe it or not, in the world. After the war, since he won the Balfour Declaration, he became the president of World Zionism. But before then, he didn't have that kind of stature. But he will just operate as a lone wolf. And as they say before, just a Manchester chevra. And they will get to people. And they will do things. And it's kind of interesting. You just say, I'm operating on my own, and let's see what we can do. From the outside, the British cabinet doesn't look that great. Lloyd George was okay. But Asquith, as I told you before, didn't want to hear anything about, giving Israel, the Jews, Palestine to Israel. That's a nutty idea. Kitchener was an anti-Semite, and Edward Grey he says, not a bad idea, but he was a very indecisive individual. So it's not too much to work with, and it doesn't look like any of them, other than perhaps Lloyd George, would be sympathetic to the Zionist cause, but you can never tell, right? Because Herbert Samuel was a member of the British cabinet. And everybody thought he's one of these English Jews, very assimilated, which in a certain weird way he was, but then in a certain weird way he wasn't. And as I said before, nobody knew that really, especially because of his wife, once again, but really, secretly, he's a passionate Zionist. You can't tell. Now, what happened was, for example, that Dorothy Rothschild, who's 18 in 1914, she's 19, she was married in 1913 at the age of 17, so, figure it out. So she invites him to a party, so I want you to meet Herbert Samuel. He's president of the local board council. He's Jewish. Maybe you can interest in Chaim Weiss and figure out this. Nach English, you know what I mean? One of these assimilated type guys. And Weissman was expecting the usual upper class British Jewish supercilious junk, and to his shock, he found that Herbert Samuel was more Catholic than the Pope. Because Herbert Samuel, this is January 1915, he said like this. He says, "The heck with a national home. We want a Jewish state." As a matter of fact, you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you. Herbert Samuel said this, he wanted to build a temple. And Chaim Weizmann says, "Are you crazy?" And then Samuel said, "Well, I don't mean that kind of temple, but some kind of, meaning he had to back off because Weizmann was around. So you don't know who you're looking at necessarily. And Weizmann was floored. And anyway, you don't know who else is out there if you're a person like Weizmann, these Manchester guys. For example, they're the chief rabbis of England. In 1914, there's two, the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic. The Ashkenaz is a big one, the Sephardic is very small, but nevertheless, it's prestigious. And so that's just when Hertz, from the Hertz Chumash, was elected in 1913. Joseph Hertz was a very eloquent guy, even though people thought he was a weirdo, and he was a passionate Zionist. He was a from Jew, he was a passionate Zionist. And very eloquent too, by the way. The other guy was the Chacham of the Sephardim. He was a weirdo. Gaster, I forget what his name, Moses Gaster, I think. And first of all, he was Romanian, that's number one. Number two, he was kicked out of Romania, even though he was the number one expert in the Romanian language. He wrote the books that they use in college and high schools to teach you the ancient Romanian tongue. It's a typical Jew. He knows more about the Geishes thing than they do. They didn't like that. He had a PhD from a German university. He was a very brilliant type of person. He wasn't exactly what you call a Talmud Chacham in the sense of the Ketsos and the Pnei Yeshua, but nevertheless, he knew a heck of a lot. And he came to England to be a professor. You won't believe it. He became to be a professor of Slavonic languages at Oxford, meaning to teach the English students ancient Serbian, Bulgarian, and all this kind of business. Yeah, he was a rabbi, right? And along that time, the Sephardic synagogue, the Bevis March, they made him the Chacham, the chief rabbi, even though he's not he's Ashkenazic by background, but they figure with his prestige and all the rest, it was not a good shidduch. You understand? He was there for many years, always a lot of fights. He always thought he's the smartest person around. He often was, but he wasn't the smartest person who ever lived. And he teamed up with Herzl from day one and said, we want a Jewish state now, and all the people disagree, we are wrong, all the people are wrong anyway. My favorite story about Gaster is he came to a lecture that was given in London, and it was about Maimonides, and the speaker got up and said, tonight we're going to speak about the greatest Jew in the last 1,000 years. And Gaster said, I thought this is about Maimonides. He was, I guess, so whatever. But the guy was a Forrest Gump. He knew everybody. He ran into everybody. It's incredible because he knew politicians you wouldn't believe. Like, he said, was a weird guy like this? No, Winston Churchill or Lloyd George or the permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office or guys like Mark Sykes. And he did somehow or other. Get it? The guy was strange, but he, as I say, was more out there than people would imagine. He knew about Herbert Samuel being a Zionist long before anybody else did, because his wife was, as I told you the other day, was the daughter of Friedlander, head of Jews College, and his wife was the one who shall I say, was the from influence, if I can use that term, on Herbert Samuel's wife. So look how the women keep popping up in this as part of the story. It's just, it is what it is. Now, as I said before, he knew from one acquaintance to the other who the players are at a time when Chaim Weizmann and all the other Zionist leaders, Nachum Sokolow, didn't. And he met early in the war. and impressed. The ultimate player, the insider with the most physical influence of what will happen to Palestine and how the British government will relate to Zionism, and that was this guy nobody even heard of named Mark Sykes. Baron Tatton Mark Sykes. Mark Sykes was an English aristocrat of incredible wealth, thousands of acres like these great landowners and things like that. And he was a conservative MP, but wasn't a liberal, he was in the Conservative Party. He was unbelievably well connected. And his parents broke up when he was a baby, and his mother converted him to Catholic when he was young, so he had a crazy background. But nevertheless, he grew up with money to burn, and he was personally interested in an amateur way in the Middle East. So ever since he was a kid, he used to go there every 1 or 2 years and travel around the Middle East, because when you're rich English aristocrat, it's a different experience. You get it? You come with 50 servants and things like that. And he went all over the place, it's actually quite amazing, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and all these other things. And he formed, as I said before, amateur opinions. The guy never finished college. He went for a year. But like many aristocrats, he figured, why exactly am I going to college? I don't need this to make a living. And if I want to get elected, I own like 50,000 people or something, and that's what he did. So he's a most unusual individual, and I would say only perhaps in the English class system to the person who is an amateur rise to such influence, especially in context of the First World War. We're Americans, most of us, so to us the term amateur is a bad word. But to the classic English culture of yesteryear, the amateur is actually a high madrega. You understand? Some of you are nodding your head, you know what I'm talking about. Theoretically, that's the supposed to be the godless of the Olympics. They're amateur. They're not professional athletes who do this for money. Don't laugh, but that's the theory behind it. And so the Englishman who never took a formal training, but just from the smarts, picked up total knowledge of this situation and become the king of Albania. That's very common in Edwardian England. And so he will become the most important player as far as Israel is concerned, as far as Palestine is concerned, in the First World War. And all the other government ministers and all this will say, what does Mark Sykes have to say about the subject? And he never heard of Chaim Weizmann, and Chaim Weizmann never heard of him. Because he's just from Manchester. He just, catch as catch can. Dorothy Rothschild never invited him to a party. You see? He never heard of Nachum Sokolow. He never heard of all these kind of people. He heard of Herzl and all that, but he didn't know these people exist. The person he does know is this Chief Rabbi Gaster, who talks to him about Zionism a whole lot, and he finds it very interesting. And Gaster, believe it or not, cured him of his anti-Semitism. It's really interesting because, listen, Mark Sykes was an English aristocrat running around the Middle East. He wrote books they can get in the library. And the books are full of what his thoughts are about the Turks, and about the Arabs, about the Jews, and the Armenians, and all the rest of it. And what do you think an Englishman is going to have to say about all these different types? And so he thought the Jews are all weird and piece of junk and all the rest of it. Not in a bad way, in a British anti-Semitic way. You know what I mean? I'm serious. They didn't do anything. But this is a class, you understand? And then he meets somebody like Gaster, who was a friend of Theodor Herzl and incredibly knowledgeable in Judaism. You can tell that. And he said, Jews do have this and this issue, but remember, there's a lot of persecutions. That's the reason for all this. Like Moses Mendelssohn said, you tie our hands and then you tell us we don't do anything. Right? And one of our main problems, some of us have concluded, is we don't have our own country. So we're always a persecuted minority in somebody else's country. So how do you expect us to be normal? And what's even worse is, this is what Gaster said, what's even worse is you end in these countries like England, where they're nice to the Jews, but that results in the Jew being like self-denying and trying to be an Englishman, and he forgets his Judaism, and he's always, have two souls or two bodies, and he's never sure of exactly who he is, and therefore he's suffering from personality defects. So on the outside he looks okay, and underneath he's a bundle of neuroses. And so and Mark says, I get that, it's very good. In economy, that's a good line. No, if I were a Jew in that situation and I was in England, I would feel the exact same way you do. Notice he buys the whole Zionist argument hook, line, and sinker. Now you might say like this: it's anti-Semitic. You understand? This is not really an anti-Semitic conversation, unless you take the very liberal point of view that if you say anything bad about any Jew anywhere at any time, that makes you equal to Hitler. But it's not true. He says, Jews have these things about them. How come people? What did George Bernard Shaw say? He said, Jews like everybody else, but more so. What's that? Why? He's always trying to show he's more English than the Englishman. He's more German than the German. What is that? You understand? What is that? It's a sign of not feeling comfortable in your own clothes. We Zionists want to have our own clothes. We want to have our own country. Like that. So, as I say before, he changed his mind significantly on Jews and Judaism and Jewish culture and all the rest of it. And these conversations take place in between these amazing trips, because in 1914, 1915, 1916, he's a top VIP, and he travels all over the world, particularly through the Middle East, to check out the Turkish front. He goes to Egypt, to Arabia. He goes to the British Army to see what's took in India and in the Iraq front, over there. They were talking about the other day. And then he goes to Russia. I mean, does anybody remember, who was it? Upton Sinclair wrote the book about Lanny Budd. He goes all over the world everywhere. This guy was like that. And in between, he stops up in England, and among other places he goes, he always sees Gaster. They have another conversation about the Jews and about Zionism and what's going to happen to Israel after the war. And nobody knows that the rabbi knows this very important Englishman, and Gaster, being the weirdo that he is, doesn't tell anybody. I happen to know the most influential civil servant in England. So he's a Zionist, but he doesn't tell the other Zionists because he was that way. And little by little, Rabbi Moses Gaster sold Zionism to Sykes as an idealistic movement. Look what we Jews have done in Palestine. The Bilu movement, the kibbutzim, the moshav, farmers who are going there and sweating their heads off for idealism in the Galilee and the Negev, all which is true. And therefore, Zionism is not something to be mocked. It really represents an ideal. We are trying to create a new Jew. What's wrong with that? The other Zionists, as I said before, don't know this is going on. In between these talks with Gaster, which again, the other Zionists don't know about, that's when Sykes, among his many other things, does the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which I think many of us have heard about. And if you hadn't, you'll hear it in a moment. And this was the famous thorny imperialistic negotiation that took place secretly in 1915 and 16 between a representative of the British government, namely Mark Sykes, and a civil servant from France, Francois-Georges Picot. And the idea was, they're doing dirty politics. When the war's over, how we carve up Turkey. And instead of making fights about it, let's see if we can arrange this now. We have to satisfy three people, three countries. Got to give Russia what Russia wants, otherwise they'll pull out of war. Got to give France what France wants. Got to give England what England wants. That's hard to do. And so each government delegated someone to represent them, and they drew the beginnings of the borders, not exactly the border, the beginnings of the borders of the Middle East today, which is why the Arabs hate it. The biggest cuss word you can say in Arab politics is Sykes-Picot. They'll fly for the handle, and I get it. Here, take a look at this.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after Englishman Sir Mark Sykes and Frenchman Georges Picot, was signed April 26, 1916, although some sources say May 9th and others say May the 16th. But this was a secret agreement between Britain and France, with Russian approval, which divided the Middle East between them. France would control Lebanon, with a capital at Beirut. There would be a sovereign Arab state in Syria based around Damascus, which would still be under French protection. Britain would be in charge of the port of Haifa and the city of Accra, controlling the bay that would make it a Mediterranean terminal for Mesopotamian oil. Palestine would be under protection of Britain, France, and Russia combined. France would get southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. Britain would also get southern Iraq, and Russia, Istanbul, and the Armenian regions of Anatolia. The map was divided pretty much with straight lines. 100 years later, this agreement still defines many of the conflicts of the region. It defined the borders of Syria and Iraq, certainly helped precipitate the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and was a big turning point in Western Arab relations, since it, in advance, negated all of the promises Britain would make to Arabs for an Arab homeland in Greater Syria. ISIS has even claimed that one of their goals is to reverse the effects of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which would be made public in 1917 to the great consternation of the Arab world.
That's just succinctly what it is. Now, it's just funny to say like this. He goes from negotiating with Picot in Paris, then he goes back for a weekend with his family, and like on Monday morning before he goes back, he stops off to see the Foreign Office, and then he'll have lunch with Gaster. You understand? So it's just kind of strange how this all worked out. Now, this agreement was a big secret. You're not supposed to know about it, because after all, the Allies are fighting this war for freedom, for the liberation of all oppressed peoples, and so forth and so on. What happened was, they're called the secret treaties. What happened was, in 1917, when the communists took over in November, Lenin, in order to embarrass the British and the French and the others, they published all these secret agreements because Russia had copies, and then the Allies looked pretty bad, you understand? But it didn't stop them from doing this. In the time I'm talking about, Gaster doesn't know about this. This is all top secret. I mean, it was official secret. And Weizmann obviously has no idea this is happening. One person does know, he's not allowed to tell. That's Herbert Samuel. Why is he not allowed to tell? He's a member of the British government. It's also, I'm serious, you know. It's what you call Official Secrets Act. It's against the law. And he's a good Englishman. You can be a good Zionist and be a good Englishman. It's not a contradiction. Not to him anyway. I don't think it is. But so, you know, Weizmann is saying like this to Samuel, I wonder what's really going on behind the scenes. And Herbert Samuel says, I have no idea. Because that's what you got to do. So, welcome to the world of intrigue, half-truths, lies, wives, everything, you know. It all gets thrown into here. Now, meanwhile, Gaster explains why the Zionists want Britain to take Palestine. Notice he doesn't know what I just showed you. And I hope you were confused by those maps, because they are confusing, right? And it's really the product of two lawyers going crazy. He was trying to get the best deal from England. He's trying to get the best deal from France. It was very confusing. That's why it didn't last. Later on, they had to clarify it, and, you know, you'll take this and I'll take that. Like a pair of lawyers would end up doing when the first agreement was too complicated. I'm not a lawyer, but I assume that what you end up trying to do is clarity and simplicity. So they ended up eventually having to do that. But nobody knows this at the time. And Moses Gaster is saying, you know, I don't know who's going to get what when the war's over, but I can tell you one thing. The Zionists want the British to get Palestine, which according to Sykes-Picot was a condominium. Russia would own it, England would own it, France would own it. That's the word, condominium. That's a recipe for disaster, because you know, Russia and France will block anything Jewish. And so we want England to take over Palestine. From the Zionist point of view, Gaster says this, Weizmann said this, from the Zionist point of view, the British have the best kind of imperialism, the non-invasive imperialism. Here, there's a picture of the British in India, and what's happening over there? They're backing the Maharaja. If you know the history of the British Empire, as opposed to, for example, the French, the English did not try to anglicize the subject peoples. As long as you didn't cause any trouble to the British, who ran the economy for the benefit of England, you could have whatever religion you wanted, you could have whatever language you wanted, whatever culture you wanted, and they let you alone, sort of like the Romans. Now, let's compare this to, for example, the French. Where the French come in, they try to Frenchify you 1, 2, 3. That's what they do. The Gallicized is the technical term, because French is the only real culture. And so it could be Africa, it could be Asia. You want to, as much as possible, turn these people into French. And as much as possible, you want to deprive them of their native culture. And so Gaster was no fool. It's like this. Why would the Zionists ever want, for example, the French to have a mandate on Palestine? It won't be Jewish, it'll be French. And anything we do will have to be in French. Ivrit won't be allowed or recognized, because Ivrit is an inferior kind of language. And Judaism is an inferior sort of thing. It'll all be, the French can't help being what they are. And the Germans, of course, would be the same thing. And the Russians do pretty much, not exactly, but the Russians do in the middle. So from the point of view of a small nation, like the Jews, the British are the best. If you know, the British Empire really was like that. Think of all these places that they ruled, for example, in Africa, in the Sudan, in Uganda, in many other places. They kind of left the native guys to run their own show, You understand? And have their own languages and all this kind of culture. And from a certain point of view, that was a golden era in these cultures because it was law and order, and everybody could have their own little tribal stuff going on. And the same thing was true pretty much across Asia. And the Jews want to be benefit from that kind of loose control. This rings true to Sir Mark Sykes. And he spreads the word among fellow players. Because the type of guy I'm talking about may have lunch with Gaster, but then who does he have tea with? The permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office, the third secretary of the War Office, the guy that's Winston Churchill's chavrusa. This is how it goes. They all meet each other in clubs, in parliament buildings, and, in train rides, on hunting, trips, and in the weekend. And so that's how you get in there. Mark Sykes never did like the Sykes-Picot agreement, as I told you before, because it didn't give that much to England, and it was a messy kind of agreement. He felt he had been forced to, come up with some common border system with Picot. But the idea begins to form in his head in 1916 that maybe if the British support the Zionist claim to Palestine, that would serve as a basis for an exclusive British control over Palestine, as Gaster had assured him accurately that the Zionists do want an exclusive British administration while they build their future Jewish state. I hope you understand what I just said. So it's a marriage of convenience. The Jews want the British there, and the British want the British there. Or this is a way for the British to get the British there. And by the way, not in a cynical way, correct? Not in an underhanded way, but in the best way. This people, the Jewish people, this great race, who has been deprived of its homeland for 2,000 years, wants a benevolent imperial power like Britain to provide the law and order, the control, the rest of it, while little by little they bring in enough people so that one day they'll have a Jewish majority and they'll have a state of Israel. And as I told you before, the best of all worlds, Israel will become another Australia, another Canada, another New Zealand. What's wrong with that? It doesn't hurt anybody. So this is the way things are developing, although no one knew it. Now, during 1915 to 16, it was all theoretical because the British weren't really involved in the Middle East, except being defeated in Gallipoli and in Iraq, as I told you yesterday, and those were turnoffs. On the other hand, totally separate from this, the Manchester Mafia is making a lot of contacts, and one lunch after another, lunch after another lunch, and another breakfast with officials all over the place, an impressive number of officials of the first rank, and more importantly, of the second rank, are being forming good opinions of Zionism because they're meeting usually with Chaim Weizmann and Nachum Sokolow. So I'm talking about people like you see on the list over here. These are the big names who, as I told you yesterday, were favorably inclined. Ultimately, that's why the Balfour Declaration happened. And not only the big shots like Lord George and Balfour and General Smuts. Who's Robert Cecil? He's the number 2 at the Foreign Office. Who's Sir Ronald Graham? He's number 3. You see? These are the guys who write the telegrams for the diplomats to, do things in different countries. I mean, they really count. And so, in an organized government, not in an unorganized, but an organized government such as the British had, you send a memo, everybody reads the memo, they comment on it, then there's comments on the comments, then they have a meeting to discuss the comments. And I don't mean this in a bad way, I mean this in a good way. So that by the time the decision is made, everybody's had a chance to weigh in, and it's done right. So if this guy says, I think Zionism is not a bad idea, and that guy along the food chain says, and that guy, then all of a sudden it becomes real. You see? So there you have it. This requires, on the part of Chaim Weizmann, about 2,000 interviews. Think of that number. 2,000 interviews and correspondence with all kinds of people. Politicians, journalists, public opinion makers, columnists, people like Graham and Cecil and other people no one heard of, second, third level officials who have a lot of input. It's very impressive. This is Weitzman's finest hour because basically he had no extra life. And he had a young wife and he had children, young kids. And so basically he had to, they all had to give that up. And what are you doing Sunday? I ain't got the time to take the kids out on Sunday. In the morning, I got to have a breakfast with this guy from this office, and then I'm going to have lunch, even though you're not hungry. You have lunch with this guy from that office, and then in the evening, I have to go and have a beer, even though I'm not interested in drinking, with the guy from the London Times and from the Manchester Guardian. And that's what and Monday, you work until 7 in the evening, and then I ain't got the time to go home after 7 in the evening. I got to go and meet this and this person. And it wasn't a fake. He really was doing it. So it's interesting how, the kind of activity it took on the part of one man. The Balfour Declaration didn't just happen by itself. That's all I'm trying to show you, okay? It took several years of input from a lot of different players in a lot of different ways. And it's only that they're all headed in the same direction, even though each one was operating on their own. He was fortunate, as I say before, he knew the right women, because they were the ones who got him into the position he never would have. Here is the Rothschild situation. There's Dorothy Rothschild. This is the famous Hannah Rothschild. She's the first one who married out. She was the daughter of the rich Rothschild in the 1800s, and he left her all the money. So I want you to think about that. Because he left her all the money, she married the #1 liberal aristocrat. She considered she was looking up. That's Lord Rosebery, who was the foreign secretary and eventually prime minister for a little while in a time of Gladstone, if that means anything. And her name was Primrose, the family name. These are, these families go back before Henry VIII, the high aristocracy. And he, of course, married her just for love, as you know. And this is their daughter, okay, who becomes the wife of the Marquess of Crewe. This is, Lord Crewe, so she's Lady Crewe, and Peggy. And let's put it this way, whoever she doesn't know, because after all, she's Jewish, she knows, because she's not. Now, she is halachically correct. Her mother was this, and she's a Rothschild. And let me say this, mixed marriages, whatever they are, the child can be positive about their Jewish past or negative. That depends on personal situation. The Primrose family were very positive about their Jewish past. They were not Jewish in the sense that they were members of the Anglican Church, like the father. Rothschild's daughter, she never converted, right? She didn't convert, but her husband was an Anglican in England, and so legally the children are Anglicans. But they grew up with all the Rothschilds as their cousins and other people like that. So it's just, I know they haven't had a mini-series about this stuff, but I told you before, they're wasting their time with all this other junk. This is the way to go. And because these people live in unbelievable luxury. You get it? Here comes Weitzman with an accent, and it makes all the difference in the world. If the Marchioness of Crewe, who's the top of the, says like this, let me introduce you to so-and-so. Here's my good friend General this and this. This is Professor Weitzman. We think the world of him. He helped England get the acetone, and he's a major professor at chemistry, and he's also a Zionist. He has very interesting ideas. That's all the difference in the world, is saying like this. Here's some schlepper named Weitzman, who talks with an accent, and, he still smells from pickles and salami, and so on and so forth. It makes a gigantic difference. And Weitzman knew this, and all I can tell you is this one especially, Peggy. Let's go to the next one. She really opened all the doors, right? Because in World War I, she gave the #1 weekends. That's what they say. Everybody was there. You understand. Like you see in these, movies and whatever, hunting things and all the rest of it. Is a war going on? Is there war going on? The old line, the children of India are not going to be helped if I eat or don't eat this food, really, at the end of the day. And so here's all these people coming back from hunting, fox hunting or something like that. And she says, lunch is served. And by the way, this is a good friend of mine, Professor Weitzman. You get it? So, but he doesn't know Sykes. He met a lot of people. He doesn't know the #1 player. Just never bumped into him. And he has no idea, obviously, that Chief Rabbi Gaster, who he does know, knows Sykes. So when he finally finds out in the end, he says, I'm going to kill you, But that's what happened. Then comes 1917, which I explained yesterday. The government changed, and Lloyd George was now in charge. The Palestine campaign now begins, as I talked about yesterday at the end. Mark Sykes is in the thick of things because the Middle East is acting up, and he has to start thinking tachlis. And what happens now if in the coming war Britain will actually occupy Palestine, if we beat the Turks? In other words, the British army under Allenby will physically take over Palestine. And how can Britain retain it? We don't want to give it up to the French or a condominium with the French and the Russians after we spend blood and treasure taking this, do we? And he talks to Gaster about it, and now he's able to discern that Gaster is not a player. He knows a lot, he talks a lot, and he does, but he's not an insider in design. He's not a player. And so Mark Sykes, very politely, he says, have a good Shabbos and all the rest of it. He starts asking the other Jews, so who's the player? Who's the Jew that really counts in this business? Now, he actually didn't know the right Jew to ask, but he had this Armenian friend, believe it or not, Malcolm. And the Armenian said, I know the right Jew. And I know the editor of the publisher of the Jewish Chronicle, Leopold Greenberg. And he's influential. He knows all the people. And I'll ask Leopold Greenberg. And he comes back, and he said, Greenberg to Mark Sykes in Westminster, and he says, I hear there's a guy named Weitzman. That's the one you want to meet. That's what I heard. There's some guy named Weitzman. And Sykes said, okay, then arrange this. And so finally, they meet the real players, Weitzman and Sokolov and the others. And they said, where have you been all my life, And so now is the time to talk tachlis. So now it's January of 1917. The Balfour Declaration is issued in November, so keep that in mind. Sykes is impressed with them. Now, these guys obviously have their finger on what's happening in terms of Zionism. They know Brandeis in America. They know what's happening in other Jewish communities around the world. And I'm sure if you're a British anti-Semite of the mild variety like Sir Mark Sykes, they must be in secret communication with the German Zionists, with the Russians. Every 6 months they have their meeting of the Protocols of Zion, that kind of thing. So anyhow, these guys really count. So they're the ones I can negotiate with. No, they're the ones that speak on behalf of the Jews. Okay, he is impressed with them. And Mark Sykes, in his own way, was an idealist. And he's thinking of a Middle East that will be under British and French suzerainty, but will be composed of 3 historically repressed races, whom the British will now liberate, and who will respond by showing proper gratitude to the British. Now, he has a utopian vision of a future Middle East. The 3 oppressed races are the Arabs, the Armenians, and the Jews. And once England liberates them, they'll all cooperate and live happily ever after. Because I'm going to tell you something. The Middle East could theoretically be one big gigantic unit. And you could have a common market of the Middle East the way the Europeans have a common market. Correct? Let's just drop our cynicism for a second, just for a second, and say, what if all the countries in the Middle East cooperate with each other? You could have a paradise. The economy of Syria and Israel and Iraq and Lebanon, all the rest, if they would just only get along and trade with each other. This one has the agriculture, this has the industry, this has the education. It could really be a United States, so to speak, in the Middle East. But of course, now we have to drop that for a minute and go back to reality. And we know that Mark Sykes was nuts, okay? But that's how he was thinking. However, in his conversations with Weitzman and Sokolov, the outlines of an agreement emerged in January, February, March, April, whatever, of 1917. The British will support a Zionist thing of some kind in Palestine, and the Zionists will then say, we want the British to run the show. In the meanwhile, while the Jews are building up their position in the country, and in the long run, a Jewish state will emerge, but slowly and organically, and with everyone else's agreement, and not in a way that will offend or hurt anybody. It was important not to make this look like a cynical imperialist ploy. So the idealistic side of Zionism, meaning a homeland for persecuted Jewry, a homeland where the new Jew can evolve, have to be emphasized. And now all of a sudden the British propaganda starts talking about that. They coordinated with the newspapers. And it was right about this time, about 8 weeks after Weitzman has his first meeting with Mark Sykes, that the United States of America entered World War I. So they met in January 20th, I think, of 1917. April 2nd, America went into war. The British, now, you have to realize, like I said before, Woodrow Wilson was clueless. And when he took the country in the war, he was of the opinion that the United States Army would not have to fight. The Navy could do it, and you wouldn't need an American army. Because after all, he thought the Germans were losing the war. The British and the French bamboozled him, and he wouldn't listen to any advice, like I told you before. He, cut everybody off who didn't agree with him. And so he fell for hook, line, and sinker, that the Germans are on the final ropes, and all it needs is the entry of America that the Germans will throw in the towel. It was the other way around, of course. The British and the French were about to lose. And all of a sudden, Woodrow Wilson finds to his horror, we're going to have to send 5-10 million men over to fight the Germans. But of course, he'll never admit that he was wrong. The British and the French in 1917 are lusting for American bodies to hurl against the French trenches. See, they run out of their own. After you did Gallipoli and the Somme and the 15th Battle of Loos and the 12th Battle of Ypres and whatever else, and Amiens number 5 and all the rest of it, you don't have so many men left over. But now we have a whole new thing. The United States of America, 11 million soldiers. This is great. And then we'll definitely grind the Germans down in the end. So, but to their horror, when the United States went to war, they didn't have an army. How big was the United States Army at the beginning of World War I? The answer is 112,000. Basically enough to hold the Indians back. So, no, I'm serious. Woodrow Wilson, as a matter of policy, when build up an army before the war. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to build up an army before we entered the war. That's why whatever Teddy Roosevelt is for, Woodrow Wilson is against. That's how the politics went into those days. And so they're very slow in cranking up the army. Let me put it this way. No time in 1917 were they able to send a big American army over. And the French and the British said, then what'd you get in the army for? What'd you get in the war for? And the Americans said, well, you kept telling us to get in the army. Yeah, but we thought you'd send in 1 million men. I said, we don't have 1 million men, Give us a while. And so it was a lot of tension. The United States was unready. There's Newton Baker, the Secretary of War, and General Pershing came in July of 1917 with 1,000 men. They marched through Paris, and they went to the grave of Lafayette, remember? And they said, Lafayette, we are here. And the French says, where? It's 1,000 men, Then they send over a brigade or 2 brigades of the U.S. Marines to get killed in Bellawood, and it made a good propaganda. But it's not an army. So I'm simply saying 1917 is a crazy year. And so in addition to that, the war was extremely unpopular in the United States. I told you yesterday. I don't ever meet anyone who knows what happened to the United States in World War I. A lot of people know what happened to the United States in World War II. A lot of books on that. But you never read too much about what happened in the United States in World War I. And this country was falling apart because the government wasn't prepared. And the U.S. Army in World War I, several million of them, all had to use French rifles because the U.S. was not able to produce any rifles. The U.S. Army in World War I had to use all French planes because even though they spent $679 million at that time on creating planes, not a single plane was produced. You understand? The level of incompetence is unbelievable, but not really, not if you know the government. So the point is, it was very unpopular, so Woodrow Wilson had to establish like a Goebbels situation. He put this guy, George Creel, I like the title, the head of the Committee on Public Information. I don't know if Kenny Lassen ever wrote about that, government censorship in the First World War. You want to look that up for one of your books. I'm serious, because that's when they prohibited criticism of the government, and they did all kinds of things like that. That's when they changed all the streets. Do you ever hear of a street in Baltimore called Liberty Heights? It's a German Heights. Wherever in America you hear Liberty, it used to be German. Wherever you ever hear of a street called Victory Boulevard, right? It's German Boulevard. You get it? The country went crazy. So the point is that it wasn't what the British and the French had hoped for. Let's put it this way. They have a job on their hands, and that is, how do you, first of all, don't get the Americans angry. They're temperamental and they're nuts, and they won't send us anything. And try to coax them into sending an army over. So who did the British send over to America as a goodwill gesture to try to politely talk to Wilson, don't insult him, and get along with everybody? Arthur Balfour, the Foreign Secretary. There's Balfour getting off in Washington, D.C. with the United States Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, and he's just there as the head of a friendly committee, you understand, to talk over war plans and all the rest of it, to improve communications, whatever the words were. He comes to Washington, D.C., he sees a dysfunctional situation, basically, and he sees the 2 most powerful people, Lamaisa, with access to the president, and the only people getting anything done is Louis Brandeis and Bernard Baruch, okay? Brandeis was the guy, as I told you yesterday, was the only person Wilson would ever take advice from and not throw him out of the office. Or, I said it wrong, he never threw you out of the office. He just waited for you to leave and then never spoke to you ever again. That's what he was. And Bernard Baruch was put in charge of War Industry Board, supposed to create the munitions and organize and coordinate the economy. You don't know this. In America during the First World War, you got electricity 4 days a week. Get it? Yeah, that's right. Got electricity 4 days. In the winter of 1917, 1918, because we needed it for the soldiers, Anyhow, I mean, the fuel also, everything. So, oil, the houses used to be done by oil. Anyhow, if you're Arthur Balfour, it's like this. 2 Jews? No. just what you would think for America, And when he meets Brandeis, and Brandeis is the head of the Zionist organization, no, naturally, He said, I bet you know Chaim Weizmann. Said, well, we've never met, but we're in communication. I bet you are. I bet you are. You understand? Mark Sykes, meanwhile, while all this is going on, I hope you can keep track of these narratives because they'll happen at the same time. He tells the French and the Italians, look, it all depends on America getting in the war. I mean, if you want America coming with both feet and not just stand from afar, you better have the American Jews on your side, because I can tell you right now, it's Brandeis, it's Baruch, it's this guy and the other guy. That's how it goes. Wilson listens to them. So you better get these guys and people like that on your side. This means, Sykes says to the British and to the French and Italians, you have to agree to British control over Palestine, not for the British, chas v'chalila, but to do right by the Jewish people. If you don't, the Americans will not cooperate with you in your battle plans. As it was, they were having a very hard time with the Americans because the generals were fighting. Pershing is famous. He would not play ball with Haig and Foch, which drove the French crazy. One of the only good things that General Pershing did, was a terrible general. One of the only things he did right was, as soon as the American soldiers came over, the British said, we want them. And the French said, we want them. And Pershing said, no, you can't have them. We're going to build an American army. But we're having the war now. I'm not letting you waste them in your thing. I'm maybe going to waste them. We're going to do it in our way. It'll be an American army under American flag, and we'll have our own sector of the front, and we'll do it our way and all the rest of it. And Haig and Foch said, but you don't know what to do. I don't care. And the result is there was a lot of tension in the Allied ranks. And so the French and the others say, we got to do whatever it takes. If you're French in the spring of 1917, you do not want to appear antagonistic to the Jewish people. Now, the French are uncomfortable about that role. Usually, they're more comfortable in the role of being antagonistic to the Jewish people. I don't mean that to be funny. I think everybody is aware. In this audience, you all read the news. They won't admit that murder of that lady was anti-Semitic murder. You know what I'm talking about, the other day in Paris, with that Muslim guy from Africa strangled this teacher, Ben Chaim, a 66-year-old lady. Now that I told you, look it up. And the French government said, oh, this was not a racist act whatsoever. It had no anti-Semitic connotation at all. The French prefer the tame Jew, like Professor Sylvain Levy, who was a professor in the Sorbonne, and he basically said, he's extremely assimilated. He said, tell me whatever I'm supposed to say. On the Quai d'Orsay, the French Prime Minister will write the speech for you. He will give a speech in the Versailles Conference in 1919 and say, don't give Palestine to the Jews. The Jews of the world don't want this. We hate the Zionists. We want the Arabs to take over. Can you believe it? Yeah. And he was one of the most eminent French Jews. And Mark Sykes said, I guess, that's for regular right now. Get rid of him. You got to change it if you want the Americans to come on board. The French are realists. By the time I'm talking about, there are 20 million French males. By the time I'm talking about, 1 million were killed. Right, so 1 out of 20 million. And by the way, that's males from child all the way up. So the ones that are killed in the middle years, 20s and 30s and all that, 1 million. And the French army, I told you the other day, was a mutiny. General Nivelle was almost shot by the troops, and General Pétain became famous. He put down the mutiny. But one of the ways he put down mutiny is we won't have any more offensives anymore. We won't charge the machine guns, at least for a while. And so they're desperate. Mark Sykes goes with Nachum Sokolow to Paris. Sokolow, very diplomatically, I told you, he learned Hilchos diplomacy, gets the French to publicly agree to a Jewish national home according to the Sykes plan. The French didn't want to do it. And of course, they say not including the churches. Yeah, definitely. Sokolow says, of course, nothing about the churches. That'll be under French control and all the rest of it. But the rest of Eretz Yisrael will be a British thing for the Jewish people. And Ribot, the French prime minister, and the others, they say, okay, we do agree. Basically, the French say, why do you prefer the British? Why don't you want the French? We're better. And Sokolow tells them what I told you before. The British have a better form of imperialism. You would try to Gallicize us. You try to make everybody French. And the French said, well, that's true. You said they had to admit the truth. So, wonder of wonder, miracle of miracles, they actually got the French to agree to what eventually is going to be called the Balfour Declaration. Although in future years, France will backtrack, but meanwhile, they were on record. And then, Sykes, who is a Catholic, he's a British Catholic, converted with his mother when he was 3 years old. He's like, now we got to talk to the Pope. So I mean, like I say, it's a movie, should be movies. So here's this English aristocrat, the conservative MP. He's like somebody out of a John Buchan novel, Green Mantle or something like that, Richard Hannay. And he's going with this guy, Nachum Sokola, from Hatzfira and from the Shtetl, to talk to the French foreign diplomats. And he says, now let's go and take a train to Rome. And because he's Catholic, he says, I'll talk to all the guys before you, and let's go and talk to the Pope. And he speaks before that, Sykes, with the Secretary of State, who's the future Pope Pius that we all knew from the Holocaust, and Pope Benedict, and he says, listen, this is going to be best for everybody. You don't want the whole Middle East to fall apart, and you don't want Russia to get too big of a chalik, so it'll be best for the British. The British will respect the Catholic Church, because why wouldn't they? And they did, correct? British never did anything in Palestine to the Catholic Church. And this Jewish idea, don't worry, it's not going to become a really bad Jewish thing, it'll be a good Jewish thing. And so, since he's Catholic, the Pope goes along. Oh my God, you got the French and the Pope? And then he goes to the Italians, they're like number 3. The Italian foreign minister is of Jewish extraction. Okay, let's put it this way. His father converted to Christian, Sidney Sonnino. Sonnino is a very common name. Sonnino is a town in Italy. It's like Bartanura, well, that's what Bartanura is the name of the town. So Sidney Sonnino is a famous Italian guy, and he said, well, if the Pope said it, okay, it's okay with me. So basically, everybody got on board behind what's about to become the Balfour Declaration. This is Nachum Sokola's finest hour. He could have dropped dead right then and there, because it doesn't get better. Now, to be perfectly honest, Nachum Sokola didn't do anything. It's all Mark Sykes. But so what? But he elicited the formal approval of all the nations of the world, or the ones that counted. All the allies are on board. And as I said before, really, I can tell you right now, behind closed doors, what did Mark Sykes say to the future Pope Pius and all this stuff? He said this. That's good. He said, listen, these guys are running the world or have a big chalik in it. So play ball. You get it? Look, I'm a Catholic too, play ball. And that's what they listen to. So I can't exactly say that the Vatican, of all places, recognized the injustice had been done for the Jews over 1,800 years, and finally the Jews deserve peace. Because, theologically, the Catholic Church never thought that way. They thought the Jews get what they deserve for rejecting Jesus. But nevertheless, whatever the reasons are, they did sign a board, and they did it. Now, the Jews, says Mark Sykes, and Woodrow Wilson, and all these other guys, look, they're distributed throughout the power structures, the political, economic. The reason the war's been gone so bad these 3 years, if you wanted the honest truth, is because the Jews, have to some degree supported the Germans and the Austrians. I mean, let's face it. Certainly the Jews in Central and Eastern Europe have supported the Germans and the Austrians because it was in their interest to oppose Tsarist Russia. I mean, if I were a Jew, I would do the same thing. This is a plain statement of raw political interest. And it's in the objective interest of the Jews for Russia not to be Germany, but the other way around. Germany should be Russia. And indeed, ever since 1914, the Germans have been doing just that. As I told you the other day, the German generals, look here. Here, the line was here for 4 years. Look how far the German army got in the First World War. I mean, they beat the pants off the Russians. It was a bloody business, of course, 3 years. But in the First World War, in the Second World War, Hitler interfered with the generals. I think many people know that. In the First World War, nobody interfered with the generals. So they didn't make, like in Second World War, dumb mistakes because of Hitler. I bet you everybody knows why the Germans lost Stalingrad. Because Hitler said, you can't retreat. Remember that? In the First World War, such a thing didn't exist. It was run by Hindenburg and those guys, and they're at least professional soldiers. So what the Germans did was, they went so far, now's the winter, dig in. When the winter's over, go weiter. Then dig in. You understand? And make sure every soldier has boots and gloves. And not like the Second World War. So the Germans won. But of course, if you're British, you say, I guess, well, the Germans are winning on the Eastern Front because of the Jews. I mean, let's face it. What can I tell you? This is a crucial factor in the Balfour Declaration. That's how the non-Jews, or influential non-Jews, the players, saw it. If the situation doesn't improve in the East, it was clear Russia goes down, and then the Western Front is in bad shape. Because these guys, who are the winners on the Eastern Front, there's Hindenburg, there's Ludendorff, and here's Mackensen. These are the famous guys that defeated the Russians over and over again in famous offensives. If you transfer their armies to the West, and especially after the British and the French have been so traumatized, but also a million here and a million there, we got to get in with the Jews. That's not the only thing we got to do. I mean, don't want to overdo it, but it's one of the things we have to do. So there you have it. Since they're playing for keeps, leaders like Sykes and Lloyd George are looking at all kinds of factors that helped them in their desperate struggle. I mean, you had the naval war, the diplomatic war, the blockade, and the Jews. And the Jews. If the Jews can be turned into enthusiastic supporters of the Allies, it'll definitely help to defeat the Germans and the Austrians. Now, how do you do that? The old-fashioned way is to bribe, intrigue, censor, play shtick. But Mark Sykes or Lloyd George tell you, that's not the way to do it. Make a grand gesture, do it right. Now, make something that'll really have an impact, put you on the front page of the papers. Think big. And what would be the grand gesture to win the Jews over? Well, Chaim Weizmann says, I've got an idea. Okay? And so Lloyd George says, I agree with Professor Weizmann. That is a good idea. Let us say, b'fnei am ve'eda, in front of everybody, that when the Turkish Empire is broken up, we won't go into the other parts of what will happen to, but Palestine will be given to the Jewish people. That will speak louder than 100 intrigues and hints. Now, Mark Sykes is no fool. He was well aware of a big problem that hovers over the Balfour Declaration. What about the Arabs? What do you do about that? He has, after all, had extensive contacts with the Arabs as well. He traveled all over the Middle East many times. Although, this is very interesting I'm about to say, a guy like Mark Sykes has no Arab friends. He doesn't meet Arabs at hunting parties. And he does meet Weizmann and people like that. You hear this? He does do that. So, cherchez la femme. Goes back to, there was no Arab hostess. It's interesting what I'm saying. Now, anyway, there are two aspects, obviously, of the Arab problem. And I'll say it again. Maybe Weizmann didn't want to think about it, but Mark Sykes wasn't a fool. He was thinking about it. Number one, they had promised a great state to the Lawrence of Arabia guys, the Hashemite Arabs. Here's the map of what King Faisal was supposed to get. This all of Arabia, by the way, including Yemen and the Gulf states, and all of Israel and Syria and Iraq and what else left? And Jordan and Lebanon. It's a big chilek. After all, that's the area of the world where they speak Arab. So one problem is we're going to have to sort of like make a little operation and cut this off, right? We'll give perhaps everything else to the Arabs. No, they won't really, but you start to see what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And that's number one. And number two, here's another little problem that no one had dealt with. What do you do with the Arabs in Palestine? They are kind of like 98% of the population, right? Maybe if I'm wrong, 97, but it might be 99. What are you planning to do this? How do you get your Jewish state? Because theoretically, the Zionists want a Jewish state. How do you do that? This was a problem. I'll tell you what I mean when I say that. There was no Zionist machinery or infrastructure that could physically bring in 1 million or so Jews and get an instant majority in the Jewish state. So here we deal with the funny business of democracy, which is so manipulated in different contexts, especially in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Usually democracy means the real majority. But what majority? Get what I'm saying? When you have different ethnicities fighting each other, so the numbers don't matter anymore exactly. Let's say, for example, you end up with a Jewish majority. Is that democratic? The Arabs are on the short end of the stick. And vice versa, if the Arabs do it. And what if the guys who get the majority use it to kick the other one out? It's funny. We're used to thinking of democracy in the Greek context where everybody's an Athenian, where everyone's an Englishman, or an American. But what if you have competing ethnic groups or tribes for a certain piece of karka? So what does democracy mean over there? And yet we all use the word. Didn't Woodrow Wilson say we're going to war to make the world safe for democracy? So it's kind of a problem. So in the short term, what the Zionists said like this: listen, just bring over 1 million people over as soon as you can, and then you'll have a million noses. The Arabs are 600,000 or thereabouts, and the Jews will have a million. They have an election, and we'll win the majority of the country, and then we can run the country, and so on and so forth. How do you do that? There were only, at the time of the First World War, by 1917, I would estimate there were 40,000, maybe 50,000 Jews of all Eretz Yisrael, because many had been kicked out by the Turks and things like that. So there's 600,000 approximately Arabs and about 50,000, something like that, Jews. How does that work? What is England supposed to do? Just declare a Jewish state and bring in the British Army, hold everybody down by bayonet while the Jews land, ship after ship with immigrants? Is that what we're supposed to do? Jabotinsky would say yes. That's exactly the plan. He wants a Jewish legion and a British army and, what does he call the colonization regime. That's exactly what he wants. And Max Nordau said, I guess, let him sleep on the beach of Tel Aviv. Just, you need 1 million bodies there to satisfy the democratic elections, and then get to Ghanetza. Meanwhile, now I'm not saying he was wrong from the Zionist point of view. The reason I say I'm not saying he's wrong is if you would have done that in 1920, you would have a Jewish state before Hitler. That's what I mean. Get it? I mean, I understand that. But you can understand an Arab might not exactly agree with that proposition, okay? And, right, the British are going to do that. You think the British government wants a jihad against England by Muslims all over the world in 1917? Or 1927, or 1937. You really think they're that nuts? In World War I, there was gigantic British fear all the way during the war that there'd be a big jihad proclaimed among all the Muslims, especially in Pakistan, which is part of the British Empire, other places, and they all shecht a million English. No, they were dreaming of ISIS 100 years ago. If you want a little bit of an idea, read the famous novel by John Buchan in 1915 called Green Mantle, where the hero is a Mark Sykes type guy, I kid you not, whose mission it is to prevent this jihad from happening all over the place and frustrating the German spies, all the rest of it. He wrote that in 1915. So what do you do? In the discussions, now all of a sudden I've taken things to a more serious plane. In the discussions between Mark Sykes and between Weitzman and Sokol, the conversation that gets hammered out in the following way. England will not say it's setting up a Jewish state, but England will state that it favors the development and the building up of a Jewish presence in Palestine, which is a lawyer's way of fudging it. The British government will not only not oppose this, but it will aid it. If, after a period of time, the Jews make enough aliyah to constant majority, matova manoim. But at the end of the day, it's up to the Jews. It's not up to the British to make this happen. And unfortunately, as we all know, the Jews did not make it happen in a timely manner to prevent Hitler. That's the tragedy of Zionism. Now, how long should it take Balfour, Lloyd George, Weitzman, Sokolow, whoever, they're trying to calculate, how long do you think it would take to bring in, 500,000, million Jews? Nobody knows. If you ask Chaim Weitzman, he was a Chad Ha'amist, 100 years. I'm serious. Because the Chad Ha'am was always very skeptical of any idea anybody proposed. He was a terrible guy. And he said, the Jews will never be able to do this, and it'll take at least many generations, all the rest of it. And Chaim Weitzman worshipped him. If you ask Louis Brandeis, it takes 30 years, something like that, which is what it took. Well, sort of. Israel became a state 30 years later. If you ask Jabotinsky, 1 year. Okay. Now, this approach has a short-term plus and a long-term minus. The short-term plus is it is sellable in 1917. It is politically realistic in Great Britain. In other words, to fudge it, obfuscate it, say you favor the Jews in some way, in some fashion, at some time, maybe they'll get a majority, maybe they won't get a majority. That is the best you can get. And that is something that perhaps the British government will sign on to. So it's, one in the hand, as they put it. It's just not realistic to think the Arabs will agree. But in 1917, the British decision makers persuade themselves, or they can persuade themselves, that this is somehow sellable to the Arabs, provided the Jewish state is not foisted on the Arabs. Now, that was not true, but they didn't actually know any Arabs. I mean, Balfour didn't know any Arabs. Lloyd George didn't know any Arabs. Milner, Smuts, they didn't know any Arabs, but they did know Jews. That's a fact. And so, as I said before, it'll work, like I'm talking now. It'll happen. We'll get to Ghanetza, as they say. It'll work. The minus, of course, is that it's totally unrealistic to think that the Arabs will ever agree to any of this. They'll be anything but violently hostile. Lawrence of Arabia knew this. He warned them. The Arab Bureau in Cairo, these are the British officers who actually knew Arabs, like Ronald Storrs. There's Lawrence of Arabia. There's these other guys, Lawrence of Arabia with the Arabs at Hasana. They what do you call it? They say you're crazy. A Jewish state for the Jews anywhere in the Arab world is a non-starter. But they don't have the final say. They have input. The British government is well organized. They get their memos. They do have the input. But in the larger picture, gets a chenetz, as I say. So the British government would never have issued the Balfour Declaration unless it engaged in Samuel Coleridge. Right? Remember what he said? You need a willing suspension of disbelief, which is poetic faith. So the Balfour Declaration, if ever there was an example on the part of serious statesmen of a willing suspension of disbelief, and Chaim Weizmann and those guys are the guys who got them to agree to suspend their disbelief. Right? Shortly after the First World War, reality hit him in the face like a 2x4, but nevertheless, in 1917, this kind of worked, as I said. Lloyd George and Balfour would not admit it, but that is what happened. They were willing to suspend their disbelief because they liked the Jews and they thought it would be good for England. Mark Sykes is no fool. He says, listen, we'll do it, but I'm telling you right now, Weizmann and the other guys, get down there, go to Middle East and talk to the Arabs. You've got to work something out with them. We'll support you, like, Donald Trump says, we'll back you and all the rest of it, but you got to negotiate something with them. So go talk to Faisal, go talk to Hussein, do whatever you need to do. The Jews will not stand a chance unless they negotiate somehow or other and work out some kind of deal with the Arabs. Now, what Mark Sykes didn't know exactly, once again, he sort of suspended his belief, is there was no way he could have a negotiation. Not really. Not really. Because why should the Arabs give up on anything? It's not two lawyers in an English law court or an American court where can work it out. These are strongly held ethnic and religious beliefs. But at least Mark Sykes, I guess, he says, if you don't get in there and talk. So here we have, in 1917, the kind of things we're hearing in 2017. Isn't that cool? Right? Isn't the Jewish world today divided along those lines? Many Jews say, listen, you've got to have a political process. You have to negotiate. Bibi Netanyahu has to get in the room with Abbas and the other guys, and you have to talk. You have to work something out. And if it looks impossible, try it again and try it again, because there's no future for Israel unless you work something out. Halonetzach tochal cherev, should the battle go on forever? We can't take this. There has to be some way. And that's like Tzipi Livni and people like that. And you say, well, the other side of the coin is, who are you fooling? The Arabs will never agree. We just have to realize it is the way it is. We have to go on, halonetzach tochal cherev. The war will go on forever, and that's our destiny. And these kind of fights are being fought out 100 years ago in the rooms of the Whitehall, of the British bureaucracy. Accordingly, by the summer of 1917, when all these conversations were happening, the British War Cabinet is willing to issue such a promise, provided it can be properly lawyered. I need the language. Because obviously, with these issues that I'm raising, it has to be worded just right. Because one wrong phrase can cause a lot of trouble. So how you do that? You can't write in a way that will offend the Arabs. On the other hand, no Arab is consulted by the cabinet, which is interesting. And so here we are in July, August, and September of 17, with the British government in a very orderly, this is Lloyd George, very orderly and coordinated fashion. Remember, he has a secretary. Maybe you don't know that. Lloyd George set up, this is famous in British history, he set up a highly efficient secretariat, which all the papers got to everybody. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, this guy is famous in England, Maurice Hankey. He became the Secretary of the Cabinet, and ever since then, everything is done in a very, protocol, organized fashion. Like I say, everybody gets to see all the papers, and everybody gets to what they call minute it, and give your little notes, and they're all collected by other secretaries, and they're distributed. And so that when you finally have a decision-making process, everything has been thought out in a proper way. I don't say that makes the British government any more smarter than the other government, but at least it has an organized level to it. And now this secretariat is being applied to the Nusach. So what exactly should we say to Jews? What exactly should we say to Jews? Is it a Jewish state? Is it a Jewish entity? Should we just say something for certain people? What exactly should we do? various drafts are submitted. They're solicited. Sokolow, how would you say it? Chaim Weitzman, how would you say it? General Smuts, how would you say it? And so forth, proposed by all different kind of people. Sir Arthur Balfour, what do you think is the right way to go? By Mark Seitz, should it be the Jewish race, which is what Weitzman put in? Or the Jewish people, which is what Balfour put in? Should it be the Jewish state? Should it be a Jewish homeland, which is what Brandeis did, because they rode across the ocean. They said, what Brandeis, what do you think? You see? A national home? Should we say, the hell with the Arabs? Should we say, protect the Arabs? You know, what is the language in there that should go? And these proposals are being circulated and discussed in July, August, September, and so forth in the meetings of the British government. After all, it was a small war cabinet, as I told you the other day. Here's a good one. Rabbi Gaster, they asked him, what do you think? He says, the British government agrees to reconstitute the Jewish homeland in Palestine. We didn't reconstitute. Well, that's the whole point. We used to have a homeland, it's reconstituted. And, Balfour said, I think it was a constitute, So in other words, to the average person, it's silly. But if you have two attorneys in a room, right, all of a sudden language means a lot. So you get drafts from opponents and skeptics. For example, Lord Curzon over here, who was anti-Zionist, he said, I don't like the whole idea. If you do, then write this in. And now, as I draw to my close for tonight, one group that the British cabinet feels it must consult for drafts are the anti-Zionist Jews. What do you guys think? Right? In other words, the Arabs have no input, but speaking on behalf of the Arabs, so to speak, are these Jews. And the struggle to prevent or scuttle the Balfour Declaration will be carried forth very energetically by certain Jews themselves. These bad Jews will submit draft after draft to mess up the Balfour Declaration, and they will be successful to a degree. This is happening over July, August, September, October of 1917. I'll say it again, these are Jews submitting this. To make matters worse, one of the worst Jews, who is violently opposed to Zionism, and I would almost go so far as to say opposed to Judaism, but that's going too far, is appointed to a high post in the cabinet, Secretary of State for India. Remember, England used to rule India, right? Look at all that. So there was a cabinet post once upon a time called the India Department, in which these highly educated British bureaucrats in London decided how England should be run. And that's a big position because you're running a couple 100 million people even in 1917. And one of the worst Jews is appointed by Lord George to Secretary of State for India. So he's not in the war cabinet, but he's right next door. And all of a sudden, the Balfour Declaration is a big danger because the worst possible person from the point of view, Chaim Weitzman, now has the ear of the British government. Lloyd George is a curious guy. He put the whole Indian Empire under two Jews. So there you go. Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State. Lord Reading, Viceroy. Viceroy of India. Most people think that's the Jew. No, this is. The Rufus Isaacs, Chief Justice of the British Supreme Court, foremost lawyer in England. Him and Chaim Weitzman do not get along at all. There's a famous story I've told 1,000 times, and now I'll make it 1,001. Weitzman and Reading met at a party, maybe one of Dorothy Rothschild's parties, and around this time, and Rufus Isaacs, who was the Viceroy of India, who'd just been nominated, and eventually would be the Marquess of Reading, said, you Zionists are doing it all wrong, you should do this, that, and the other. And basically, Chaim Weitzman said, the rest of you are now, you talk like a fool. Me, a fool? Viceroy of India, Chief Justice of the British Supreme Court, Home Secretary, this, that, and the other, which is true. And Weitzman said something very interesting, which I've often quoted. And he said, look, every person is a combination of smart and dumb. Some are 50-50, some are 70-30, some are 30-70, right? Everybody has a certain amount of smart and a certain amount of dumb. Albert Einstein is like 95-5, okay? So there's no question, with your brilliance, you're definitely what you call a 90-10 or a 95-5. The problem is, the 95 of you that's smart, you lavish upon the English. The 5% that's dumb, that's what you contribute to the Jewish people. So when I'm hearing you, I'm not hearing a well thought out kind of person. I'm hearing some guy has nothing to do with Yiddish guy just spouting off at the top of his. They're very smart. There's a lot of truth to that. Anyhow, whatever the case is, the story was about to get really tough because both of these guys were anti-Zionist. They're in the bosom of the cabinet until they came along. It's just a bunch of nice Gentiles. You know, why do you have to spoil it with the Jews? General Smuts is a nice guy, as far as the Jews are concerned anyway. Lloyd George, you know, come on. Why couldn't they keep the Jews out? Everything was going good until the Jews showed up. And though not intending it, the British cabinet, in the middle of the year 1917, had ignited a Jewish civil war that would rage on both sides of the Atlantic during the fateful year 1917, a civil war that would be fraught with great consequence to be continued.